Hi, everyone. I'm here with my dear, dear friend, Wendy Gray. She is a deep lover of trees, just as I am, an activist, an advocate for the living world. You've worked with on so many projects all over the world, but we have had this incredible journey together. So I feel in my heart such gratitude for your presence here today, given what's just happened. And it would be beautiful if you can introduce yourself first, honey, and then we'll dive into a conversation. You're muted, my love.
Thanks, Samar. I think you've done a pretty good job, but essentially I'm also a long-term practitioner of Tai Chi and a Taoist as well, which gives us a certain perspective on Mother Earth.
Thank you. I'm really grateful that we get to go into this on a more spiritual level today as well, because I know so many of the places we intersect and interface, we're dealing with legal issues, with governmental issues, with really heavy, very dense, very unconscious energies. And so just the balm of being able to talk at this level is such a gift. I was really inspired right when we started to ask you, Wendy, how did you get into this with trees? Like, how did they first call you?
It was probably through my Tai Chi training. I've been training for over 25 years. And essentially, bit by bit, I just became more and more focused on the environment and on what was happening in the environment, and essentially watching and looking and researching. I've done a lot of research. I do a lot of research all the time. It's just one of those things that comes to you, as you well know, Samar. And essentially through that, I just became focused on it. And also coming back to New Zealand, I lived in the UK. Coming back to New Zealand pretty early on, I used to come back every so many years. Suddenly I was aware of the environmental destruction that the settlers of New Zealand had wrought on our country. And it wasn't just the settlers. Essentially, there was a lot of settlement in New Zealand, despite what is taught in history. There was a lot of settlement, and there's been a lot of human settlement in New Zealand over centuries, and therefore a lot of human interference in the land.
Yeah, I mean, I think what frustrates me sometimes, like, you know, I only came here at age 23. Like, I have my own tribal background. I'm a national of another country. Like, to me, there's always what it feels like a healthy distance personally from the miasms and the stories that circulate in this country. But one of the deepest frustrations, and I just need to preface this by saying I'm so grateful to the land. The land is such a healer. I'm really frustrated by the human intersection with this land. And I've been really frustrated for many years watching how the rest of the world sees this country as clean, green, GMO-free, nuclear-free, everything's this pristine Hobbitville where nothing bad ever happens. And the reality on the ground is destruction, toxicity, a deep disrespect. And in many ways, it feels like an assault on what we would call feminine energy. Like go ahead. You're muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just muted myself. Definitely, we are great charlatans here, I think, and I think it's a good word for what's going on at the moment in New Zealand. There's a lot of charlatanism, but there are also people here who see. There are also people, great healers here. There are also the land itself, as you rightly say, it needs a lot of healing, but at the same time, it has something special, and we have all these portals. We are known as the violet, the mauve country from space. We are violet, we are purple, we are mauve colored, and that's for a reason. Yeah.
Tell me more. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what I know, but essentially it's about the energies that are here. as I mentioned briefly, there are portals here, and these are properly kept quite secret. And at the same time, there are people here, whilst the mainstream have their own paradigm and narrative, which isn't accurate. There are people here which are related back to the ancient ancestors of New Zealand, who were known to be peaceful people. And these were the people who were joined by the warrior nations of the Polynesians. So that is how New Zealand changed, but essentially the ancient ancestors were peaceful people. And that peacefulness over a very long time generated a beautiful energy. And we also are the nation of Punamu. So let's not forget the Polynesians, and Kupe is a famous one. The old law of Polynesia is that Kupe would come down here for the purpose of finding Punamu. So the Punamu energy is very special.
So we're talking about jade and nephrite for people outside of this country and just the crystalline structure. And so my immediate question, because this stone is so revered by many cultures present and their ancestors, is what's the connection with trees? Because it's a green stone. Like, I'm curious because I've never been anywhere with this much fecundity. Like, if you throw a tomato seed in the ground, the next day there's like a tomato forest in certain parts. Like, at least that's how it's been until now. The fertility, the kindness of the earth to flora is quite something to witness. So I'm curious, like, if in your journeys here, like, why trees are so happy, why the earth takes in trees so easily, and why humans are so bent on their destruction.
From my training, teaching, Tai Chi training, from my Taoist training, I would say, my perception is that we're dealing with different vibrations, and humans who are intent on destruction, who don't know what they're doing, are from a lower vibration, and they are doing things because the higher vibrations make them feel uncomfortable, and trees have a higher vibration. And particularly when you have at the moment in our real world here in Auckland, urban Auckland, where you have a dishonest intention by our local government, by particularly central government, which is having a bigger and bigger say in what happens in Auckland. The dishonest intention to develop Auckland with no consideration or care of what happens to the biodiversity and environment of Auckland, then you have people doing something which they know to be dishonest, and they're feeling very uncomfortable about the higher vibrational beings that trees are. And this is about personal gain. This is about something, some are driven by personal gain, some are driven by political dogma. I find it extraordinary to watch that these people can't see what's going on, but they can't, as you have that problem with as well. But unfortunately, we have to witness this because it's some kind of process that we have to go through.
So there's so many rich threads in what you've said. So I just want to parse them out really quickly. One is obviously the tangible mistakes that are being made in dealing with situations. For example, what happened on Mount Albert yesterday. Another massive example was Western Springs. Another example was Canal Road. Another example was Big Mac in Avondale. So super briefly, because a lot of the people on here may not be familiar with this. Yesterday, very well documented by me what happened. Western Springs was a thriving forest that you personally, I know, were fighting for years.
Mm.
Its overstory was pine, and pine is hated in this country, which makes no sense because it's one of the most, if we're talking vibrationally, it's one of the most vibrant, loving, like clarifying plants there is. And these kinds of old land management perspectives that go bad tree, good tree, but can't see there's a native forest that's regenerated under these pines by itself, which is going to struggle now because there aren't places for natives to live anymore. They need a sheltered, am I right in saying that?
Forests grow well under an overstory. They have a structure. They have an understory, a middle story, and an overstory. And essentially, Western Springs had that. The pines were nearly 100 years old. But essentially, and let's be clear, pine trees are ancient medicine too. So they had lots of terpenes. They had grown slowly. Underneath that was a totally regenerating native forest, which it had some plantings, but not a lot. And it was closed canopy at that stage. So there had originally been 700 pines there. There were only 200 left, and they wanted to clear fell the whole forest. So that would destroy the understory, which is exactly what happened. And that destroyed 30-year-old native trees as well. They would not survey the understory, and essentially the whole project was being driven by money. And the most cost-effective way of dealing with the issues of the pine, which were talked up because the trees were mostly healthy. There was a percentage that were getting to be dangerous, and that could have been managed. As I said to you, originally there were 700, there were only 200 left, and they had all been managed down one by one. And that's what the residents wanted, to continue with that process, which had worked perfectly up to that point. However, as you well know, we had a super city in 2011. Our local government was taken over by major corporate, and the preferred contractors were driving a clear felling agenda. And this project actually ended up costing in excess of $2 million, when if we had actually managed it down, it would have been in the hundreds of thousands.
And you would still have a regenerated wild native forest.
We would.
Versus now a giant landscaping pile of something.
Well, actually, the problem then became, because they never followed the resource consent conditions. So because it was council gives itself resource consent, and that process took years because of our challenges. But essentially, they didn't follow their own conditions that were put into that resource consent, and they mulched all these 100-year-old pines and put it all over the hillside, which means that this mulch is full of terpenes, which means it's difficult for things to grow in it. And now the mulch is moving towards the stream at the bottom of the hill.
So I have a question. If Western Springs came down in April 2021, I was in New Mexico at the time, and it was the most horrifying news to just receive that and hear it and know that I'd drive down that highway every day and not see those trees again. And when I came back, my garden, which is very wild and very much like an ecosystem, was, I would say, at least like 4 times the bird life, because these refugees had nowhere to go from that forest. Mm-hmm. But what I'm curious about, and this has been on my mind since the flooding on Friday, had that forest stayed intact, do you think the zoo would have been hit the way that it was?
No. The residents who had lost their trees earlier, because the pine forest went right along behind the stadium, said that when they lost their trees, suddenly there was this great wind.
That's what happened yesterday on the Mona. Suddenly,
exactly.
But it was an angry wind. And in like the traditions of Don Eligio, they call, and Central America, they call it mal vientos, which is evil winds. And it's like deep, deep rage from the earth. And also, who's protecting us from that now? So
well, they're not there to protect us. I went in with some really fabulous arborists who are mature arborists, older people, and who are really great. We used to have great experts in New Zealand, and they explained how the forest was working, how the trees needed each other because they grew in a forest. Forest trees lean on each other. They grow to actually need each other. They are a community, and how when you take them out, you start to weaken the community.
It's so hard, Wendy, because you know how much, like, and I still, like, you know, the level of suffering yesterday. And I was sharing with you before we press record that the pain I was in and the waves of pain I'm still in, it feels like it's not just mine. And I know I've had this experience since from birth. Like, I was a weird little kid. I was the weird little nature kid who would like collapse if someone was killing a grasshopper and like desperately like be beaten by other children trying to protect an insect. Like, was sharing with Steve today that this has just been my whole life, is we've got to save everything. And I think there are many people like that. I think you're one of those people. I think I met many people like that whose sensitivity is deeply misunderstood by the majority. But what you're saying that's so intense and painful is the loss that they're experiencing. And all of last night, I was just apologizing and saying, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And I could feel their spirits and the confusion in the trees that were left behind. But one thing that's really hitting me, so many years ago, I did the Project Jonah marine mammal medic training. And one of the things that was so poignant is how cetaceans, they don't cope when they're separated from family. And they actually have, at that stage, the research showed 4 times the neural like bundles and neural programming for familial bonding that primates have. So for them, separation is death. Like if they're separated, they will beach themselves in agony trying to get back to the ones close to them. And what's so painfully beautiful about what you're saying is I've recently been looking at the statistics and the just interesting information about whales and whales' role in carbon capture. So big whales and what they do in the oceans, similar to what forests do. Yep. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And I'm seeing like a parallel. One of the parallels I've already seen between big like cetacean species and trees is, of course, they're elders. They're intelligent, they carry wisdom, they live for a long time. Yep. They manage ecosystems in a peaceful way. They have a very different role to, say, a wolf or a tiger who's an apex, or a polar bear who are apex predators. Their role are like grandparents. Yep. They keep things alive. And then I feel like the wild irony that they're both also climate managers.
Oh, totally.
And then we just hit at them like they're nothing. I'm curious what this stirs for you.
Well, the one thing I was about to go on to say is that in weakening the community, we also weaken their immune systems. And one of the great, I mean, even science is starting to see this in the kauri, which is our kind of one of our premier species, endemic species. The kauri lives in communities. The kauri immune system is damaged by the loss of junior members of their community. And that community goes a long way because we know now about the underground fungi and the underground bacterial network, which links everything underground. And essentially it also kind of, from what I understand, there is also an astral network that links all these trees. And particularly the big ones like Tana Mahuta, like the big ones up north in Waipua Forest, these are all linked astrally across the world as part of the climate management process, as the whole organization of the climate management. So when we do these things without proper consideration, we are damaging ourselves. We are damaging our climate management. And we are also damaging the networks. So because these are like spider webs, which we cannot see, we are ignorantly going around destroying ourselves and our environment.
I mean, I shared with you the dream that I had, and I've shared it with a couple of friends, but I think this is a good moment to share it in the context of the story. So not last night, but the night before. So around maybe 9:30 p.m., the TMA had done their media release that the works would begin and the tree would be removed, the one tree that had fallen very badly. And so, you know, there was a level of like, what's going to happen, but never in my conscious mind did I think this level of like destruction could happen overnight. So I went to sleep. I had a dream where I was in my kitchen with a paintbrush, hand pollinating little plants, and then placing them on the altar behind me where all of my teachers live and sacred objects live. And then I left the room in the dream and I heard my partner shouting. And I came in and a candle had caught fire and went up the wall. And it broke the altar in half. And the horror that went through my body, I woke up in a state of absolute terror and horror. And given what I saw yesterday, I'm not surprised. It is the breaking of an altar. Like that stand of eucalypts were a high altar. And our mutual friend Yo speaks about the First Nations Australian elder who came and said, "These are my ancestors, please take care of them." And so my only solace, and it's a very distant solace right now, is that they initiated their own demise through the slip. And I can only pray that there's something that will come out of this, some activation for all of us. But on a practical level, I feel like there's so many things that could have been done that wouldn't have resulted in this. I'm curious what you think.
Yes, and it's very difficult working with the Monga. As you well know, they were quarries. So they are unstable naturally. And over the years, people who lived around the Monga have planted these trees to stabilize the slopes. That's one of the primary functions of those trees, is stabilization. The other function is, of course, in Auckland, we have a problem with stormwater infrastructure, and these trees are sequestering thousands of gallons of water. Therefore, these considerations need to be taken into account first. These are ongoing problems which are going to be exacerbated by what was done yesterday. And instead, we have cleaned out what we consider to be the problem. And this is part of the errors that New Zealanders make when they look at these kinds of problems. They, instead of looking at how we can stabilize using and with nature, working with nature, they consider themselves to be the ones with the solutions, which end up making the problems often worse. And in this state, it is highly possible that that's exactly what they've done. It's very difficult to know, but it is a large possibility given the instability of the Monga.
I mean, I see such a parallel without being reductionist and without being simplistic. I'm seeing a parallel to the mindset of kind of allopathic medicine. So, you know, there are times and places, certainly, where surgery and antibiotics and emergency meds, like there are times and places you want that technology, you want that education that will save your life.
Yeah.
But the finesse of managing a living system, that may not be where that's at. And there isn't a lot of forward thinking. I need to solve this immediate problem. My job is to solve this immediate problem.
Yeah.
However, I've created a massive problem. That's not my problem, because then my job's done.
Yeah.
So can we talk about what potential massive problems for people who really know nothing about this, just at the simplest level? Of course, we don't know. We can't predict. But should it go wrong, what might occur?
Well, I mean, let's just take it from the perspective that everything is connected. Okay. We like to think of everything as being separated. And this kind of thinking that has resulted in the solutions that were implemented yesterday is a separation thinking. If we applied ourselves in a more connected way, we would see the whole situation differently. And we would see what can we use, what's actually happening here? First and foremost, what's really happening? It's the one question we never ask. What is actually happening here? You know, and it's what I teach people constantly. You never go in with a plan. Forget that. That's just human interference kind of thinking. What you do is you go in and you go, well, what's actually going on here? You know, I would like to do this, but what's actually going on first? Because maybe it won't cost me as much. Maybe if I did it slightly differently, like, you know, put in swales instead of grey infrastructure, you know, it'll be cheaper and it will be more long lasting. You know, it may have a bit of maintenance, but hey, you know, it looks better, costs less. But it's that kind of thinking, really. What could result in it? Well, you know, Samar, you've been up there and looked at it. It's an unstable monga. What we need to be doing is stabilizing it as much as possible. And the best way to stabilize, as we know, is trees. And to take out healthy trees that are properly fixed is kind of strange thinking.
Well, it's suicidal thinking too.
Yeah,
it's for, you know, it's for a one-day access for a vehicle. There had to be other ways to do this.
The problem with that is that, you know, I live in Greyland where we have developers developing properties all the time, and you would be astounded at the smallness of a digger that can go into these properties, and to put in to make an access for a big digger when you only need a little digger is crazy. It's just ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
The worst of it is, Summer, is that what they're doing with that digger, the person who's on that digger really needs to know what they're doing, because they can make a monumental mess.
Oh, it's just so sad. Like, and I think another thing that what was really apparent to me yesterday was that, you know, not just that we talked about this a little bit as well, not just that people don't know what they're doing, or they have reductionist mechanistic thinking, or that they're looking at solutions only for the next like minute of their lives and their immediate surrounds, and the myopia of like me as the center of the universe.
Yeah.
I think another serious issue that's been highlighted here is the lack of education in grief, the lack of knowing what to do when things go wrong. And I was up there and I was racked with my own grief, but I'm watching so many innocent dog walkers just deeply confused by this forest that's disappeared. Then it's only 9 trees, but they were massive. And just the scale of what 9 trees could create in terms of protection, of sound, of wind shelter, of like privacy, of softness, of energy. Like, if people can translate those numbers into statistics, because we're trained to just go, it's just 9 trees. But it wasn't just 9 trees. And these people stood there in confusion. And then they had to quickly come back into, okay, I can't get affected by this. And I think the lack of capacity for going, this is awful, is part of the problem.
Yeah, and it's we know better than this here. We have really good Indigenous teaching about how to manage these situations. And what is worse is that the very organization, the Chiputamonga Authority, is representative of that culture, but it fails to implement its own cultural teaching. And what I'm referring to is this process of prayer. We have very powerful prayer we call karakia in this country. And this process should be implemented every time we have one of these problems, particularly on a monga, which is managed by an authority that is representative of Indigenous culture. But that is not happening. And that is part and parcel of the confusion. These people who have didn't realize they were relying on this environment, these trees, for health and wellness, for support, suddenly find that support gone. That's the confusion. And that need not have happened had we followed our own cultural teachings. If we do these things properly, everybody can take part. And that is their cultural teachings, but they never do it. It is very low vibrational behavior that we are getting from this authority, and it is not representative of their own people's culture.
So sad, Wendy. And when you're speaking this, what's really landed for me is, even though I was deep in a migraine when the day started, I'd had that awful dream. I had very little time. I had just been on the phone with you. I had an appointment, but my whole body was like, go up right now. And like physically in a migraine state, I don't have a lot of strength. Like everything is overstimulated. Like just every sensation feels 10 times stronger. But I had to go. I was being summoned the way I was summoned in October 2019 when this started. And there was a guard who's like, nope, you can't come in. You can't walk this way. I'm like, so where can I go? And I had my dog with me. He goes, you can go that way. I was like, great, dude. I do know my way around here. So it's like, so I crawled under bushes so that I could see what was happening. And it was hard. It was just horror. It was like, this can't be real. And yet I couldn't leave. Like I couldn't not look, like someone had to look. And so when you speak about karakia and you speak about prayer and you speak about the inner knowing of every traditional human culture, that in times of great calamity and destruction, someone has to be there and someone needs to call in spirit. Otherwise, where are their souls going to go? Like, where are the human souls who are doing this? Like, what's going to happen to them who have dissociated enough to do this and look at it as an object and not see it as a 100-year-old being who carries like medicine from a 60,000-year-old culture, who's related like biologically to the trees here. They are relatives. Yeah. Eucalyptus used to be here once.
Wandana land, that I consider them to be natives myself, actually. And actually, as we were speaking sometime earlier, we were overseas where eucalyptus has been planted in places they shouldn't, like Spain. They are considered a pest now, but essentially in New Zealand, eucalyptus is actually really, really helpful because we do have currently a lot of water issues, and eucalyptus, as you rightly point out, it sequesters a very large amount of water.
Well, they also do really well here. And if something does really well here, one of my teachers, like her teacher's medicine is that if a plant grows really well for you, it's for you. And so even this idea of a pest and pestilence is a human idea of what we don't like to see versus what the earth is trying to do.
This goes back to this whole issue of what is happening, what is going on here. What are you actually seeing or not seeing? and put your cultural teachings to one side and just be curious. This, of course, is the new teachings of Wilding. This, of course, is well illustrated by that article that I just sent around about the 200 million trees that have grown naturally in Niger, one of the most inhospitable countries in the world, in Africa, which is teaching the world about wilding trees. And that's only as a consequence of a missionary who watched what was actually going on and realized that old practices, which had been changed by colonialist French who went into Niger, that old practices were destroying the land and causing the temperatures and everything to go higher, that they were the old practices were the ones that restored the land and restored the trees, because once you restored the trees, you change the climate.
Well, it's bringing up a much bigger issue. So I'm thinking of the property that we manage in the Coromandel and the perspective of the landlord that's like every wilding pine needs to go to restore native forest, and the conversations we've had around, it's not exclusive to these people. It's a New Zealand mindset, is like wilding pines are bad. But the reality of that land is there's so much native regeneration under pines.
Yeah.
The reality of my backyard is I'm being taken over by kawa under the camellias and under the ginkgo.
I'm completely taken over by kawa. I have to pull it out. Yeah, I've got so much kawa.
There's so much, and it's so happy because it's found a forest floor finally. So they're migrating back. These plants, there's a punga that's trying to grow into my house. It's so massive. And I'm just it's taken some years, but if you just leave it alone and you let trees do what they want, they start to bring back the medicines that are endemic because they're in the soil.
But what I've been told about pines is that they came to this land to restore the land. And I spoke to a number of people before the Western Springs forest was destroyed, actually a couple of years before, and this person told me they know that it is their time, but essentially they feel their work is done, that they have, and that work was to restore the land. And that is what the pine tree has done for New Zealand. And I just wanted to mention the work of a guy called Richard St. Barb Baker. He was called the Man of Trees. He is a very prolific writer, and I collect his books. He was around in the early 20s, 30s, and 40s, and he came and actually lived in New Zealand at one point in the 60s and 70s. He was first asked to come to New Zealand from England, but because of the problems in the Central Otago, where they had taken all the trees off the land for mining, for gold mining, and the farmers brought him out and he advised them. And that's why we have so many exotic trees, is because they desperately needed trees quickly to stop the land from being washed into the sea. And so when he first arrived, they were about to, the government was about to give up the forestry department. And he convinced the government not to do that. So essentially, he is actually responsible in quite a large way, I believe, for the forestry industry in New Zealand. And it's interesting because all that he did here and around the world, he was very important in Kenya and in Africa and the Sahara, trying to, and replanting there, getting the re-educating the native peoples back to their ways of living and looking after trees. But all that he taught us and all that he did, and he was quite remarkable, very remarkable Baha'i man, we forgot. Somehow along the way, we really forgot in the last, I think, the really evil part of what's been going on in New Zealand politics for the last 20, 30 years, maybe more. Our government has, I guess, I don't know, they'd never worked for the New Zealand people. Some of the things that they have done are just quite despicable to the New Zealand people. And essentially, we've lost the knowledge.
And I think then we interface with the future. So the last kind of couple minutes you're talking, the energy is going like, okay, and now what comes next? So there's this incredible awakening around the world of revering our bone ancestors from everywhere and their traditional wisdoms, and going back to very deep ways of living, that essentially what's common is that life is sacred, like in everything, whether we're talking about Niger or we're talking about anywhere in the world. The more I look at these projects and what's happening at Eligio-Ponte National Park, like I spoke to Maria and one of her rangers, and just I asked the ranger, why do you do this? Like, why do you get up at 5 a.m. and then come home for 1 hour, and then sometimes you're there in the mud till like 1 a.m.? He goes, because if I don't do it, it'll be gone. And he's like, I don't look at it as work. I look at it as a holiday every day. I get to go be in such a high vibrational place, and I need to protect it for the people who come. And like, they have nothing. They have absolutely nothing. But every time I talk to or listen to people in those situations, the one common thing is a reverence for life, and that life matters. And the one commonality in every corporate industrial machine approach to land management, regardless of where in the world or what kind of person is doing this, is there's no reverence for life. There's only reverence for human identity or human gain, or it's a human-centered approach. Whereas in any situation where there's regeneration, actual regeneration, like plants don't die instantly, it's because the focus is on the world, the living world. And what the last little piece coming in really strongly, many years ago, I read a book by Jiang Rong called Wolf Totem, and he was talking about Siberia and when part of, I'm going to say this wrong, it may be Outer Mongolia, but essentially when the Chinese invasion into one of those areas and the systemic wiping out of the wolf and the effect that had on the grassland. And there was one line in that book that changed my life. And he said, you know, we, the humans, the animals, we are little lives, but the grass is the big life. And if the big life goes, everybody dies. And so that's the difference. I'm just seeing a chasm. I'm seeing two ways humans are dealing with life. Either life is at the center or we're at the center and life has to bend to us. And so going forward with this very intense time that we're in, like the earth is in a lot of tumult. Like, what can be done from your heart? What do you see?
I personally feel that it is time for us to hold the space for the future. We have to be really careful about being tied up or engaged by the negativity and the nastiness and the evilness, because there is plenty of it. If we are creating the future, then we have to hold that space for the future and what that future is going to look like. It's a creative space. It's an energetically creative space. And we have to have calm places, that we have to do our meditation, our prayers. It is a kind of disciplined process, because essentially to hold life sacred means that you need to live differently. And that is with reverence, with ceremony, with understanding that there are things in this world to help you do those things, like crystals, that the plants themselves are there to help you, and that how you see these things is not as a nice to have, but as something that is absolutely necessary for life. And that's not your life. It's life itself, because you are part of a small part of a very large whole.
Thank you. There's like so much wisdom in what you're saying, and it's almost like I want to keep going and going, and the energy feels like it's reaching a natural conclusion of this share. So is there any last piece that you want to bring to this conversation?
I think one of the most important things to understand is that the people who are doing this don't understand what they're doing. And for us to engage too much in being angry with them is not actually going to be fruitful. It doesn't help them. It just makes them more defensive and more resolute in what they do and think. So essentially, it is with softness, and that is always the Taoist way, that we have to work around like water. We have to raise awareness through raising knowledge, experience through education, and we have to do what we can, but remain calm and graceful.
Challenging, but thank you. Thank you for your time and your heart and your kindness and lending your wisdom and your experience to this. And my prayer and hope is that it'll touch whoever feels inspired to listen to it. And, you know, I really do believe that, and I've seen with my own eyes, that the things we do around us do impact the world. Like those 9 trees had such an impact on the world. And so, you know, if we can protect a very small area, then we have changed the course of history for that area.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samar. Lots of love.
Thank you so much.